Okay, here you go.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this evidence session of the Oriel Roads Commission. My name is Carol Souter and I'm the chair of the commission. And I'm very pleased to say that we have two experts with us this afternoon to answer our questions on historic environment and legislation issues. We are going to make this session available via a recording on our website once it's completed. And we hope that that will be helpful in sharing information from our experts to a wider audience. Each of the commission members will be asking a question in turn, or questions in turn, of our witnesses. And just to be clear, this is very much a factual evidence gathering session. So we're not going to be asking people to give us views on hypothetical situations or to comment on applications which may or may not emerge in the future. So what we're asking people to do is to tell us what happens in terms of process and how they would handle things. And I think that that will help us as a commission understand the situation more clearly and help us come to our views and our recommendations. So our first guest this afternoon is Emily Gill from Historic England, and we will be asking her questions, obviously, about the role of Historic England in this series of processes. And then we will move on to Gill Butter from Oxford City Council to ask her about the local authorities' role and the ways in which it gets involved. So I hope everyone will find this afternoon useful and informative. We have received 4 questions in advance, having announced this session, and we will try to cover those issues during the course of the afternoon, and our guests have been informed of those questions. Okay, thank you very much indeed. So we are going to begin with the first question for Emily, which is going to be from Margaret Casey-Hayford. And I'm going to ask each of my colleagues on the commission to simply introduce themselves as they ask their question. So Margaret, if I might ask you to start, please.
Thank you very much. I'm Margaret Casey-Hayford. I'm a former planning lawyer. I was a planning lawyer for 20 years. So I'm coming at things from that planning and listed buildings perspective. And my first question is, the building has been listed with the grade 2 star, and it would be really helpful for the Commission to have an overview of the way in which historic buildings are protected in this country and why the building would have been listed as grade 2 star. What were the considerations? And basically setting the grading in context. So in other words, why is this a 2 star rather than 2? And also the building sits in a conservation area. What's the implications of that, and how different is that from the protection that it gets as a listed building? Why is it not enough just to put it into a conservation area? And if one wanted to make changes to the building, what sort of considerations, what sort of process is involved in gaining consent to make changes? So there's a lot there.
Thank you, Margaret. Emily, would you like to summarise the situation?
Great, thank you, Margaret, and thank you, Carol, and other commissioners for having me here today. It's a pleasure to be here. Shall I start with just a very quick introduction of my role? It might be useful just to set that context in. So, as Carol mentioned, my name is Emily G, and I have worked for Historic England since 2001 in a number of roles, including as head of listing in a previous role. My academic background is in Afro-American studies, in architectural history, and in building conservation. and my role at the moment is the Regional Director for London and the South East at Historic England. And Historic England, as I'm sure you know, but it's worth setting out, is the government's advisor on all matters related to the historic environment in England. So I'm here representing the views of Historic England in answering your questions today. And thank you, Margaret, for that one. I'll take through. I'll take those in turn and talk starting really with the way that historic buildings are protected in this country, which is in a number of ways. I'll start with listing, which has been around since 1947 and which is set out in the Planning, Listed Building and Conservation Areas Act of 1990. And listing applies to individual buildings and structures. There are about 400,000 list entries on the National Heritage List for England, and we refer to that as the list, and I'll come back to that, I'm sure. Listing is about identifying, and I quote, special architectural and historic interest, and is also about helping to guide the management of change in the planning process within the planning system. And our role at Historic England, one of those special roles we have, is to advise the government on which buildings should be listed. Now, most listed buildings are listed at grade 2. That means special in a national context. About 5% are listed at grade 2 star, which means they have more than special interest. And about 2.5% are listed at grade 1, which means that they are buildings of exceptional interest in a national context. And in terms of changes, any changes that affect the significance of a listed building would require listed building consent, and that is from the local planning authority. You also asked about conservation areas. These exist to manage and protect the special architectural and historic interest of a place. So this is an area-based designation, and it can very much be the case that a listed building can be also within a conservation area. So we have layers of designation in some cases. There are about 10,000 conservation areas in England, and these are designated by the local planning authority. So differently to listed buildings, it's entirely a local authority managed designation. And when a building or structure is within a conservation area, they are then some extra planning controls and considerations to protect the historic and architectural elements that make that particular place, that area of structures and landscapes special.
Thank you very much. That was very helpful.
Thank you, Emily. Shaista, would you like to ask your question now, please?
Hi, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Emily, for being here. So I'm wondering if you could explain the role of public authorities, especially Historic England's role in implementing legislation.
Yes, thank you. So, well, local planning authorities make most of the decisions regarding change to heritage assets. And it's local authorities who are responsible for deciding whether or not to give planning permission and list a building consent. Historic England is a statutory consultee in a range of cases, in a number of different scenarios. For example, Historic England would be consulted by the local planning authority on listed building consent applications that relate to grade 2 star and to grade 1 listed buildings. Also, if in the case of demolition of a grade 2 building, for example, and we may comment additionally on other cases at our discretion. In addition to this statutory role, Historic England publishes a wide range of advice notes to help owners and local authorities manage the historic environment in their care and guardianship. And with regard to contested heritage, Historic England has produced a checklist to help local authorities deal with contested heritage listed building decisions. This checklist helps local planning authorities and others to identify and to assess the relevant considerations and to make a decision in accordance with legislation and policy. And this checklist in itself is likely to be a relevant material consideration in any planning deliberations. And that is published on the Historic England website and might be a useful document and tool to refer to.
Thank you.
Thank you. Could I just ask one follow-up to that, Emily, if that's all right? You said that the the contested heritage statement could be a relevant material consideration in any decision-making process. Could you just say a word about what other sorts of things might be relevant material considerations? Do you see what I mean? Just to give us some context about why that might be relevant.
Yes, well, I mean, the general process is set out in the National Planning Policy Framework, and I'm sure we'll talk through that a little bit this afternoon. So the tests and the considerations apply to any scenario, and the local authority will be guided by those in undertaking any decisions. I mention this in particular because it's a fairly new checklist, but it exists principally to aid and assist local authorities in thinking through the decision-making process. So it's a next layer down of advice that sits below the National Planning and Policy Framework, alongside all of our other Historic England advice notes, which advise on different matters, such as taking into account other factors within the historic environment in the planning process. So I hope that it's a useful checklist and guide, and it sits very much within a suite and a nest of documents that support decision making within the National Planning Policy Framework.
Thank you. That's really helpful. Peter.
Hi, Emily. Thanks so much for joining us. We've had an incredibly helpful letter actually recently from Duncan Wilson. Setting out the kind of framework and background and policy stuff. But here's a kind of wider question. Why would you list a building in the first place?
Great, good question. So planning, the Planning Listed Building and Conservation Areas Act 1990 sets out the general principle behind the answer to that question. That if a building or a structure is considered by the Department for Culture, Media and Sport to be of special architectural and historic interest, then it will be included on the list. And historically, buildings were assessed on an area basis, initially by parish and then by districts. These geographic lists were then reviewed and amended as part of a national resurvey in the 1980s. And since then, buildings have been considered for listing on an individual basis as individual additions to the list, or perhaps as part of a thematic project. And we now consider whether a building should be listed largely based on a test of threat. And an application for a new consideration for listing, or indeed to amend an existing listing, they're made to us at Historic England, and we undertake an assessment with the greatest of care and return our advice back to government, to the Secretary of State, who will then take the decision.
Delisted.
Delistings, yeah. So sometimes buildings are delisted. A building can be removed from the list if it no longer meets the criteria, perhaps because of new evidence or new understanding of the special interest of that particular building, or maybe of a material change in its circumstances. And it's perhaps worth also saying that the criteria are set out in the Principles of Selection for Listed Buildings. That's an important document. And we produce at Historic England a wide range of what we call listing selection guides, which sit below the Principles of Selection. And they talk about what kinds of characteristics might be taken into account or considered for different building types. So again, there's a suite of different documents that set out very clearly the decision-making process. And then we work within a structure of using professional judgment and those guidance documents to return our advice.
In the end, it's an aesthetic value judgment, isn't it?
Well, it's a judgment based on a wide range of criteria. Aesthetics is a factor. Architectural interest is one of the key points, also historic interest. So that's why these selection guides are so important, because they set out the wide range of different things that we consider when assessing a building for listing, through to its age value, its aesthetics, its degree of survival, its significance to the national story. Those are all factors that come into play in terms of our assessment.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
And Emily, perhaps you could, you talked about the possibility of delisting. Can things move between gradings as well, and you pointed out that 2-star is at 5%, a small percentage of the total, and one star even smaller, 2.5%. What might prompt a revision of the listing level?
You're absolutely right. Yes, buildings can be upgraded, and usually that will be because there is even greater interest than we originally knew or thought. It happens sometimes with buildings which are maybe historically lesser appreciated, for example, Victorian and 20th century buildings. And the passage of time means that listings may sometimes warrant a reassessment. With a designation regime that has been around for as long as it has, it's inevitable that with new information, new knowledge, sometimes there is a reason to reevaluate and to reassess. And that's what happens when buildings are upgraded from 2 to 2-star, for example.
Thank you very much. Jeff.
Thanks, Carol. Thanks for joining us, Emily. I'm Jeff Austin. I'm chair of the Oriel Alumni Advisory Committee. From the general to the specific. In the case of Oriel's building, could you tell us when it was first listed and why, and then when its grading was subsequently amended? Why? Thank you.
Yes. So the Rhodes Building, as I understand, it's been called since the 1920s at Oriel College, was first listed at grade 2 in 1972. So it's an Edwardian building, and that was when it was first added to the list. In 2010, we at Historic England, although we were then English Heritage, were asked to consider upgrading the building. That was prompted by proposals from Oriel College at the time to add an additional floor and to alter the High Street elevation. And often change can be a trigger for us being asked to reevaluate the listing of a building, which was the case then. We picked up that assessment and considered the criteria that are identified in the Selection Guide for Education Buildings. And this has since been updated and rebranded as the Listing Selection Guide for Education Buildings. And that's also available on our website and talks about the kinds of things that we take into account when considering schools and colleges, for example, for listing. And our assessment at that time in 2010 identified that the Rhodes Building's long established special interest resided in a number of areas, that it was distinguished for its architectural quality, for its architectural authorship and its place in the work of the architect Basil Champneys' work, for its elements of innovation in collegiate planning and design and sanitation. It's quite innovative in that regard as well, for how well it survives, its degree of survival and intactness, for its impact and presence on Oxford's wonderful High Street, and for its historical and commemorative status as seen as the sculptural programme in general throughout the building, and for its historic interest for the connection to Cecil Rhodes, albeit a controversial figure. And all those factors were taken into account in putting forward our advice to DCMS, which was to upgrade the building, which we recommended in December 2010. And a decision was taken by the Department for Culture, Media and Sport in January 2011 to upgrade the building to grade 2-star. And it's been grade 2-star from that point.
Very helpful.
Thank you. And just to pull out, Emily, the point that you were making there, that which I think helps explain the role of Historic England, that in effect you provide the expert advice, and it's then for the department in the person of the Secretary of State formally to agree the listing decision. Is that right?
That's right, yes. It's the decision is always taken by the Secretary of State, sometimes delegated to ministers, and it's our role at Historic England to provide that advice for them to consider and to take the decision on.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Zainab.
Hello, Emily. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time to talk to us, listening to you. It's very, very enlightening. Thank you for your clarification to the questions that are being asked. They're clarifying a great deal in our minds. I'm Zainab Badawi. I'm a broadcaster and also chair of the Royal African Society. I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit about how important one individual feature might be in the overall listing. How do you assess or evaluate that? Thank you.
Thank you. So buildings are often listed for a wide range of reasons that contribute to their significance. For example, it could be a combination of great age, of overall architectural design and quality, interior arrangement and decorative schemes, a highly significant architect, degree of survival, as well as group value with other listed buildings or a complex. And it's really the list description, the list entry as we call it, which is the important guide for identifying and setting out where the special interest, architectural and historic interest of an individual listed building lies. In some cases, it is primarily one feature that contributes to significance, and we are very careful to define that in the text and the map and the extent of listing, so that implies in some situations. However, in most cases, a building is listed in its entirety, and with more recent listings, we take great care, as much as is possible, to identify relative significance in different parts and aspects throughout a listed building. And there's this list entry, which is very much the starting point for owners and local planning authority colleagues to understand what contributes to a building's significance.
Thank you very much.
Okay, I think, should we go straight on to Laura? We might come back on some of these questions for a little bit more expansion in a moment or two. Laura.
Thank you, Carol, and thank you, Emily, for taking the time to be with us tonight and to offer some of these clarifications that have been really important. I'm Laura van Broekhoven, and I'm the director of the Pitt Rivers Museum here in Oxford. And so one of you've already touched on this, but just to sort of maybe whether you could expand a little bit on how it is decided whether a change to a listed building is significant or not. So maybe could you take us through the different steps of decision making and who would be involved at what stage?
Sure. So it's the National Planning Policy Framework, which clearly sets out how the significance of a heritage asset should be assessed, how any harm to it should be balanced against public benefit. The National Planning Policy Framework requires that great weight is given to the conservation of designated heritage assets, including listed buildings. And with listed buildings, local authorities have a duty to preserve a building's special architectural or historic interest. And when assessing proposed changes to a listed building, the decision maker would need to consider whether the changes affect the significance of the listed building, and that's the term that's used in the framework. Significance is comprised of archaeological, architectural, and historic interest. It's worth saying perhaps that many changes would not affect a building's significance. For example, the replacement of modern bathroom or kitchen fittings. On the other hand, many would, and the degree of impact on significance will vary. For example, the removal of a single fireplace would reduce the architectural interest of a college building, perhaps to a modest degree, but the subdivision of a principal room would be likely to be far more harmful. When considering contested heritage, our checklist, which I mentioned earlier, can be a really helpful tool. The process of understanding a heritage asset's significance is important, as it helps the local authority put into perspective relevant historical associations, both positive and negative, as well as other factors such as the quality of the fabric or the artistic endeavour involved. Understanding what's significant about a historic object or site includes all the diverse values or interests that people associate with it. And understanding communities' perspectives will be an important part within this process as well, as will drawing on a wide range of other academic and information sources. An understanding of a asset's significance will arise from more than just its physical appearance. The date it was designed or created, these things are really important. Also is the interest of the form chosen, who or what it commemorates, and it will include the reasons for its creation and why that's being challenged now. And so those are some of the points about sort of understanding and defining significance that we set out in this checklist that I referred to earlier. as I also mentioned earlier, Historic England will be consulted by the local planning authority on certain listed building consent applications. So that includes works to grade 1 or grade 2 star buildings, as in this case. So just to sort of emphasize that, the roads building at Oriel College, because it's listed at grade 2 star, a proposal to remove an aspect of it, a statue, for example, would require listed building consent, and Historic England would be consulted as part of this process by Oxford City Council. But the decision on whether or not to grant listed building consent would be for Oxford City Council to make.
Thank you, Emily. That's really helpful. Can I just pick up on something to reflect a question which has been put to us, Emily, about the fact that the statue was specifically part of the design and referenced in the list description. I'm not for a moment going to ask you to speculate on what might happen in any particular case, but from what you've said, would it be reasonable to assume that anything that affected that would be a key element for you to consider and to advise on if you were asked about a planning application? So if you were asked about something which meant a change to something that was specifically mentioned in the listing description, that's something that you would address very directly in your advice.
That's right. Yes, we would weigh up the significance of that particular asset, that part of the building. We would use the list entry as a tool and a guide for that, as well as other considerations and understandings of it. And we would provide advice on the significance of that and its relative value to the listed building, and weigh that up as part of our advice back to the local authority.
Thank you. Can I move on to Michelle then, who I think has got a related question?
Yes, thank you very much, Emily, especially for your reference to harm in the previous answer. So the question I want to ask is, what issues do you consider when assessing whether a proposed change could cause harm to the historical or architectural importance of a listed building? And then I've got a follow-up question after that.
Could you repeat the question, please? Sorry, it's a bit hard to hear.
No, that's okay. What issues do you consider when assessing whether a proposed change would cause harm to the historical or architectural importance of a listed building?
We would take into account a starting point really of significance. So working out how significant that particular aspect of the building is, and weighing up its relative importance to the listing overall. And then we would assess that in the National Planning Policy Framework, which talks us through a process of working out how to identify harm. We would give an assessment of where we thought the level of harm lies. And then we leave our advice at that, an element of a discussion of where the significance is and what the level of harm is. And then the decision is then remains with, or is left to the local planning authority to weigh up whether or not that harm is offset by public benefit. And because the public benefit can often extend much beyond heritage benefit, that is a factor which is left for the local authority to decide.
Thank you, Emily. And my follow-up is, are there ever circumstances in which harm can be justified?
Public benefits can cover a wide range of considerations and are likely to go, as I mentioned before, far beyond straightforward heritage issues. The continued conservation of a heritage asset is a public benefit, even if its historic interest is contested in some way. The alteration of a contested asset may provide public benefits. These might relate directly to the heritage asset, for example, by adding an additional interpretation layer, which could help people gain a deeper understanding of the historical context, which led to the creation and installation of an asset. In relation to designated heritage assets, it's vital that the authority, the local authority, sets out the harm and public benefits very clearly and analyzes those considerations to be able to come to an informed decision. And the National Planning Policy Framework sets out how to analyze this, bearing in mind that heritage assets are irreplaceable. Any harm needs clear and convincing justification. And there is a presumption in favor of sustainable development, which is reflected in overarching objectives for the planning system: economic, environmental, and social.
Thank you, Emily. William, would you like to come in now, please?
Thank you very much. I wanted to go back to the issue of contested heritage, because that really is the crux of our concerns and questions. When you, as English Heritage, not you personally, advised on the listing of the building in 2010, I expect there was not then any very clear public concern about the building. And the situation that we see now is, over the last 10 years, there has been a significant growth of public concern about the building. And I wonder how English Heritage deals with that sort of issue, where there's a significant shift in the nature of conflict, or the character of conflict. And I also wanted to ask, is it the local planning authority that makes the final decision, or can there be appeals, and how does that work? If it has to go, can it go up to a higher level, and who makes the very final decision?
So you asked about when we originally upgraded the building in 2010 and our understanding at that stage and how that might have changed. So we were quite clear at the point at which we upgraded the building about the controversial nature of Cecil Rhodes, and that was part of our discussion at that time, and that's reflected in the list entry. So that layer of interest and sort of controversy to his biography is acknowledged in the listing, and it also gives it assigns significance to that association, the historic interest of the statue, and the association with Rhodes is part of the historic interest of the building, and both those things are acknowledged in the listing, and I think that's, you know, that is not contradictory. It's you know, we don't make a moral judgment on the nature of assets when we're listing them. We reflect the history and the biography as we understand it, and put that there and include it in the listing. We are very alive to the fact at Historic England that our past can be difficult and contested, and that there are very strong and conflicting views on the nature of the heritage which we have inherited. Our shared heritage is inevitably, in many cases, is conflicted and contested. And we have given a lot of thought to this as an organisation, and have developed a position to allow us to grapple with those complex issues when managing change to the historic environment. And our position is, has as a starting point, has that understanding. It's very, we want to be clear about that we understand that our past is complex and contested in some cases, and that's something that we need to work together to resolve. That leads us to a position which we developed in 2017, and which remains very much our position about how to deal with this contested heritage in the historic environment. And that is that we believe the best way to approach statues or sites which have become contested is to keep them and to explain them with thoughtful, long-lasting and powerful interpretation and context. This allows us to keep the structure's physical context, but can add new important layers of meaning and understanding, which we feel allow us to develop a deeper understanding of, as I say, what can be, you know, a complex and contested past in some cases. It's very much our view that people should raise concerns about memorials with a difficult history, and that the most important thing in some regard is to have the conversation and to discuss and debate that openly as an entire community. But as the government's advisor on the historic environment, we believe that removing difficult and contentious parts of the historic environment would risk harming our understanding of our collective past. And so we're very much of a view that we should retain and reinterpret, contextualize our heritage to allow a fuller and deeper understanding.
Could I just ask about the word removing there? And do you mean removing from its very specific site, or do you mean removing from public view? Because of course things can be moved in such a way that they will have even greater attention paid to them.
So we talk about keeping in situ, remaining in situ, and responding or explaining, reinterpreting on that site. There are a number of examples of this. I think it's something that we are open to examining is how reinterpretation and recontextualization can be done thoughtfully and powerfully. And we are looking at examples from around the country and around the world that do this well and that demonstrate best practice in this regard. And our door is very much open to conversations with owners and local authorities about how to do that and how to do that well and meaningfully.
Thanks. And then could I just go back to this issue of the ultimate decision, you could call it? Yeah.
Yeah, so when there's a difference of opinion in the process. So ultimately, it's for the planning authority as decision maker to weigh up the harm against public benefit, and the Secretary of State for Housing, Communities and Local Government does have the power to take over or call in, as we say, planning applications rather than letting the local authority decide. The Secretary of State will normally only do this if the application conflicts with national policy in important ways or is nationally significant. Anyone can request that an application should be called in, and among the things which would require the Secretary of State to consider whether call-in would be appropriate would be a formal objection from Historic England or from one of the national amenity societies.
Thank you.
That's really clear and helpful. Thank you very much, Emily. I wonder if any of my colleagues wish to ask anything specifically further of Emily following those comments. Anything anyone wishes to raise? So I'm doing that classic thing of looking along a line. Margaret, please.
Thank you very much. Emily, thank you. That was really helpful. I just got a question about instances of demolition of parts of listed buildings. Are there instances when parts of listed buildings have been demolished because they might create a situation that's harmful to members of the public? I mean, for example, if there was a wall of the building that was in a perilous condition.
Yes, so there are situations where for health and safety reasons, changes might be made in advance of gaining listed building consent under the urgent works notice because of works which need to happen for public safety. So that's within the power and the remit of the local planning authority to undertake, and then would apply retrospectively for listed building consent to address those particular needs. Or there's actions which had been taken place. So it's something that we don't advise on. It's very much something for the local authority to consider if there's urgent works which need to be undertaken, and then the consent process comes after that.
Thank you.
Thank you. That's also extremely clear and helpful. I'm just looking along to see if any of my other colleagues have additional questions. And I'm not seeing any. Emily, that was incredibly helpful. Thank you. It's always extremely refreshing, if I may say so, to have every question specifically answered and everyone to add extra information for us. And I think we've found a lot in that which will help us. Unless there's anything that you would like to add, Emily, I should, as a courtesy, give you that opportunity, obviously, if there's something you feel we haven't asked you that we probably should have. Is there anything you'd like to add generally?
Thank you, Carol. That's thoughtful. I think that perhaps one thing that would be useful to mention, in addition to our position, which I would like to emphasise, and I encourage you to look at our website for that, and indeed for that checklist, which I hope will be a useful number of considerations, is just to make the point really that we believe that the list, the National Heritage List for England, has also become a tool for public history. It's a publicly searchable document, so it's important to keep it up to date. And we've undertaken a number of amendment projects in our endeavour to convey the sometimes complex and controversial histories and associations which lie behind the buildings and places which are on the list. For example, in 2007, we undertook a project to play our part in commemorating the bicentenary of the 1807 abolition of the Slave Trade Act, and we made over 40 amendments to the list for sites associated with abolition and slavery. And all this material is online, and it provides, we feel, a contribution to the wider discussions about fully understanding our shared heritage. There's also a facility to enrich the list, whereby any member of the public can update listings on a separate layer of the list with extra information and images. And we encourage people to take part in that way of engaging with heritage and history and the list, so that we can all better understand and appreciate the intricacies of our collective history. And I think it's just important to be able to share that with you, as in addition to our general position about the importance of using heritage as a way of understanding contested heritage through keeping but retaining and reinterpreting and thinking quite carefully about how we can use that in a creative and powerful way.
Excellent. Thank you very much indeed. And I think the point about being able to enrich the list and so on is one that we would be very happy to reflect back. And I think you're right that maybe that's not always so clear to people, that it's possible to make comment that adds layers. So thank you very much indeed, Emily. That was extremely helpful. And I think you may wish to stay with us, but please feel free to leave us when you need to. Thank you. I'm going to turn now to our second guest, Gill Butter, who works for Oxford City Council. And Gill, I'm not entirely sure that I got your title right, when we were referring to it earlier. So would you be kind enough to explain your role in Oxford, and then would you be happy for us to go into questions in the same way?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Carol. Well, my name's Gill Butter, and I'm one of the principal heritage officers at the City Council. So there's a team of us. And I work in what's called the Urban Design and Heritage team. So we're a combined team. I'm an architect, and I've been working in conservation since the late 1980s, but have only been at Oxford for the last 4 years. So that's my background, and that's my title. And just to explain that we're here, we're a team of professionals who advise colleagues, so planning officers, elected members, so councillors, and members of the public who make applications or seek advice on the historic environment. So basically that's our role as professionals, to be here and to provide that advice and guidance in the processes that the planning department, the local authority, has to take.
Thank you very much, and welcome. We're very grateful for you being with us this evening. And in the same way as we had a number of questions for Emily, we have a range of questions for you as well, Gill. So I'm going to ask Laura if she'd like to begin, please.
Thank you, Carol, and thank you, Gill, for being here with us tonight, and again, probably answering a lot of our questions. I wanted to start off with a question which sort of really where we want to know a little bit more about whether you could explain the role of the local authority in relation to requests to make changes to listed buildings.
Okay, so essentially we're the primary decision maker. As Emily explained, we're the first port of call, and we make decisions on most, not all, but most of the applications that would come in to make changes to listed buildings. We have an important duty which is set out, as Emily pointed out, in the Planning Listed Buildings and Conservation Areas Act, which is set out in two parts of that act, which is to preserve or keep from harm the significance of listed buildings. Effectively, it doesn't quite say that because the act is slightly out of date in comparison with where we are, so significance doesn't exist in it, but it's inferred. So that's our duty. So that underlies, that's what we have to do. So that's, you know, the baseline. So effectively, the Section 66 of that Act requires that we shall have special regard to the desirability of preserving the building or its setting, or any features of special architectural or historic interest which it possesses. So effectively, that's its significance, that's its importance, that's what is valued about it. And so our role is to assess that significance, that importance of the building, and to consider what the impact that changes will have on it. So whether they will harm or whether they won't harm that, and to balance those two issues. So the change, the significance, which is the important thing we have to preserve, and the harm, and we have to balance those issues to decide whether it's acceptable to make those changes or not, or whether other changes should be made, or you should look at it slightly differently. So that's really basically where we are.
Thank you.
Sorry, I had a classic Zoom unmuting moment there. Thank you.
Right.
Thank you, Jill. Could I now pass to Peter, please?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I should have said earlier, I didn't introduce myself. I'm Peter Ainsworth. 100 years ago, I was Shadow Secretary of State for Culture. I now chair the Heritage Alliance, as well as the Churches Conservation Trust. And thank you very much for joining us. I think you've sort of answered this question a bit already, but I'd like to ask the difference in approach that we may apply to a listed and an unlisted building change application. And I'd like also to ask what account you take of the Historic England checklist, which we've heard about earlier, and how important and binding that is, or whether it's just a checklist that you need to look at. And also, given that you've got a huge number of listed buildings in Oxford, I mean, has this happened before? And what experience do you have of dealing with it?
Right. I'll start with the last bit because it's probably the easiest bit, in the sense that I've only been at Oxford for a short period of time. So I can only say from my experience, I haven't, but I don't know of it particularly. I mean, things have bubbled under, but I'm not aware of the particular thing coming quite to such a head. So that's the one issue of the local of the difference between listed buildings and non-listed buildings is that listed buildings are protected under the Act. So we have as the duty that I explained before to preserve and enhance, whereas unlisted buildings, or you might say buildings in the, I'm not quite sure, but we have unlisted buildings or what are called undesignated heritage assets. So then they're not listed, they're not on the statutory list, but they might be considered to be of local significance. So that's another layer. It doesn't have a statutory protection, but it is defined in the NPPF, and we obviously take the NPPF is important as a policy document, government policy document that we follow, and so we follow the principles of that. And so there is a paragraph in there which deals with undesignated heritage assets, and those can be things that you, in the process of a planning application, for example, you may come across something that is you feel is quite as significant, has a local interest, built by a local architect or something like that, and you consider, well, it doesn't comply with the characteristics that Emily described in the guides, in the guides of the different types of buildings for listing, but it's important locally. So that will be a non-designated heritage asset. So it will fall under the guidance of the NPPF, and we do have to pay attention. Paragraph 197, I think, of the NPPF says that we need to take care of the significance of non-designated heritage assets, which is obviously a local significance, so it doesn't have the same weight necessarily of harm that might be caused to it, but we still have to take and do that balancing act of harm against any public benefits that might arise from the changes. So that's what we're required to do with non-designated heritage assets under the NPPF. And then, of course, you have conservation areas, which is another level. In the sense, so you have a lot of buildings. We have a lot of buildings in conservation area, and one of the prime examples is North Oxford, where there are a lot of buildings that are quite significant, nationally important architects, Wilkinson, Moore, designing those villas, and they're not listed. They're important pieces of Victorian architecture. They're not listed. Their only protection is the conservation area, and planning is essentially permissive. You have to remember that, so you can do something unless you can't. And so a lot of works can be done to those buildings unless we impose a level which we can, but we have to justify, which is called Article 4, which takes away some of the permitted planning changes that can be made. But what you're thinking about in a conservation area is a different issue. It's the group, and it's what you see from the public domain. So it's not the interiors of the buildings or some of the historical elements within them. But it's actually how they sit together as a group, because a conservation area is very much a place rather than necessarily a building, so it includes the spaces between. So it's a different level of thinking about how you consider it. But again, there are duties under the Act which require us to consider not harming the special significance of conservation areas, the character or appearance of the issues. So it's, yes, so we do have duties. The statutory protection is slightly more nuanced, and we have to apply a little bit more and think about it a little bit more carefully if we need to do that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Gill. That layering of protection, if you like, is obviously in a city like Oxford particularly complex, and does mean, as I understand what you said, mean that really quite large areas have a degree of protection, albeit that individual buildings within them may not be specifically listed.
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you. Margaret, would you like to come in?
Thank you very much. Again, going from the general to the specific, and this is very specific, really. So I'm not talking about the whole group of the Oriel buildings, or indeed others within the conservation area, but the actual roads building itself on the High Street. Have you had formal requests to make changes to that? And can you tell us what the steps would be if you receive such requests?
Right. We haven't had formal requests, in recent years, to change that specific building, although Emily referred to the 2010 point in time when the listing was upgraded, when there was a request to add an extra layer on top. In fact, a layer has been added on the top. There is an attic, a modern attic on the top of that building, which was added at that time or just after that period in time. And so that is the last request that I'm aware of that we've had to change that building specifically. But if a formal request were to be made, then, so in other words, a listed building consent application to make a change to the building would come in, then first of all, the application would be registered with us, and it would be advertised. It will be advertised. It has two types. It has site notices, which you've probably seen around Oxford. They're all over the place. They litter the place, unfortunately. also it's advertised in the local newspaper, so local people can be aware of what's going on, and communities and local amenity societies aware. But also we have a statutory duty when the building is grade 2-star listed to send out specific consultations, as Emily mentioned, to Historic England, and depending on the type of the change. So if it includes an element of demolition, and that's the definition of demolition, even of a small part of the building, it can be a small part of the building being demolished, then we have to consult the National Amenity Societies, which Emily also referred to, which are the SPABs, Society for Protection of Ancient Buildings, Ancient Monuments, CBA, Archaeology, Georgian Group, Victorian Group, and the 20th Century Society. And they get consulted as a sort of batch, as it were, and the relevant people pick the bit out that they want to. So that consultation also goes out. What applicants, very often, we encourage applicants to do, usually under what we call a pre-application process. So when changes are considered being made, we often encourage applicants to come to us pre-app. But if a formal application comes in, we will encourage maybe more local consultation, but that's not necessarily, or that may happen. But as I say, that can happen through the site notices, and the Oxford Times and hawkish eyes will pick those out very quickly. So then that application is then processed, and we deal with, as I say, we do that balancing act of looking at what the significance is. Formally, the applicant has to provide that detail of significance, and some do it to a certain level, and some do better than others. But we also have to look at that, and then we have to look at the levels of harm, and then we have to do the balancing act in order to make the decision with taking on board all the consultations that come back. So that's the process, really. But there's another layer in there. So and Emily did refer to that actually, if an objection is raised to the proposal by one of the amenity societies or by Historic England, then the application has to be referred to the Secretary of State for decision. So it's not, so whilst I say the local authority is the primary decision maker, that can happen.
Thank you very much indeed. That was very comprehensive.
And just to pick up and underline a point, Gill, if I may, you said that if an objection is raised, then it has to go to the Secretary of State.
Yes.
Is that what? This is going to be a very elegant sentence. Is that the case, whatever the officer's assessment has been? If you see what I mean. So,
if an objection is raised, then it wouldn't. I think yes, it still has to be referred to the Secretary of State. But what we'd normally do if an objection is raised is to discuss that and look at the possibility of trying to resolve those issues. So it's not an absolute at that point in time, in the sense that if we can work to remove that objection, then clearly, you know, rather than going through that process, then we will do that. We will normally, but that usually involves extending the period of time, the statutory period in which we have to determine the application. So that actually quite often, or not quite often, but we would normally try and seek to do that if we can.
okay.
Can I just come back on that, if I may? If the Secretary of State then receives notification of the objection, can the Secretary of State say, actually, I've looked at the papers and I'm not interested? Or does that automatically trigger a public inquiry?
I think that they would normally make a decision or recommend a decision, certainly. I'm not sure that they don't say that they're interested, because it's a formal process. So I think that they have to go through that formal process, as it were. So they'll either, I mean, I think the local authority will then sort of set out a report and set out, you know, what their recommendation is. But this decision rests with the Secretary of State, obviously, and they will make that decision. And they will take advice, obviously, from Historic England and others that to make that decision.
Thank you. Jeff.
Thank you, Carol. Thank you for coming, Jill. An even more specific question. Could you tell us whether you had any formal requests to make changes to the plaque for Cecil Roads in King Edward Street? And if you did receive such a request, would the next steps be any different from those you've just outlined?
It's interesting. No, we haven't. But the answer is that the plaque is not protected. It isn't listed, and it's not on a listed building. So the answer is that it may require planning permission to make, depending on what the changes were. I mean, if it was to add something to it, you may require planning permission to do that. But as I say, planning is quite permissive. And so there are a lot of elements of things that you can do. And I think it falls into what's called the General Permitted Development Order, which allows certain things to be carried out, provided that they're carried out in using similar materials or with a similar approach to the existing. That, you know, planning permission is not actually needed in order to carry out those works. So it would really depend on what the works were. But obviously, if an application were to come in for changes to that, then it would be considered under the conservation area. So it would be considered in terms of its impact on the conservation area. So there would be that level of historic environment consideration for that element.
Very helpful. Thank you.
Picking that up, could I just ask whether there is a different level of consideration between the General Permitted Development Order consideration, which I think you were saying is basically you can do it unless it looks sort of particularly out of kilter. Is that because it sits within the conservation area, or would you be able to do things in a non-conservation area?
Yes, the permitted development relates out beyond the conservation area, but the doing it in a similar manner or in a more careful manner relates to the fact that it falls within a conservation area. So within the permitted development order, that is the sort of strap line to being able to do certain things without permission in a conservation area.
Thank you. Thank you. That's clarified it for me. I wasn't entirely sure of that. William.
Thank you very much. I should have explained as well that I'm a historian who worked at the University of Oxford from 1997 to 2015, now retired, and I'm an emeritus professor, and specialised on Southern African history. I wanted to come back to this apparently quite central issue, I think, of harm and how we think about it. There seem to be two different elements to the concept of harm. And one is a historical or architectural aesthetic element to the concept of harm, which may be neutral in relation to any social issue. And the other, which has sort of come up but has not been very clearly defined, is an issue of social harm. And this is really the crux in the kinds of deliberations that we must have, because I'm not saying it's unique, but maybe in Oxford it's very, very unusual for there to have been sustained protests about a part of the building. Well, it's about a statue, of course, but in terms of the debate that we're having now and trying to think about listed buildings, the issue is that a part of a building has been considered by a significant number of people to have social harm. So I don't know if you've had to deal with cases like this before and how you approach these or balance these two different ideas about harm.
Yes, it is difficult to balance the issue of harm. I mean, ultimately, what is it that we have to consider might be harmed? And essentially, we have to consider the harm to the significance of the historic building or the conservation area or whatever, the heritage asset. So we always have to think it's harm to the significance. So what it is that's important about the asset, and what harm to that would be. And Historic England set out, actually have some very good guidance in a document called Conservation Principles, which actually sets out clearly how to look at significance and sets it out into different values. And I think that's quite important to consider. What are the values that you might think that this building or monument or structure might have, and it sets out there the different values that the building will have, and I think that so in that respect we do look at other issues. It's not simply the architectural or the historic. We might also look at communal values that the building might have, and also looking at, you know, social value as well. And I think it's when you start to think about conflicting or contested heritage and thinking about the views, I think it's important to think about. One of the things that the NPPF requires us to look at is and says that development is acceptable when it's sustainable. And and it has 3 principles of sustainable development, which is when it achieves economic, social, and environmental gains. So social and society and community comes in there again. So those layers will come in when we're doing that balancing act of weighing the harm against public benefits that might be achieved or not. So harm does have more than that simply aesthetic view, although the duty that we have is to ultimately to preserve the significance of the asset.
Thank you, Gill.
If I could just follow up very briefly,
yes,
if new research maybe confirmed elements of the social harm, could that be taken into consideration?
It could, but we have to remember that it is a balancing act. It is a balancing act, so it's always weighing those harms up.
Thank you very much. Thanks.
Thank you, Gill. And I think it's really helpful, and I would suggest that it may be helpful to our audience as well, for us to perhaps attach links to some of the references and documentation that both Emily and Gill have referred to through our website, so that people can find those more easily, if that would be interesting and helpful to them. Because I think during the course of the evening we've had a lot of references to detailed material that is informing the decision making and the processes that both Historic England and any local authority in this situation would need to go through. So I think we will go back through these answers, draw things together, and put relevant links and so on the website, so that people can look at those things themselves in more detail, if that would be of interest. Michelle, I'm wondering whether you want to develop your question, or whether there's something else that you might like to ask at this stage.
And thank you, Gill, especially for explanation around harm, because I think that's, especially within the context of Oxford and multicultural Oxford, I think that's quite another layer to consider as well. Actually, I was going to ask in relation to harm, but this is going to be quite a hopefully a straightforward one. Health and safety. When we talk about harm, actually, reading through some of the previous incidences, etc., that have involved the statue, even I want to say previously to these discussions where students have found ways to interfere with the statute, whether it's traffic cones or plaques or pictures or whatever. Do the planning, when it comes to talking about removal or enhancing or any of those aspects, do they take into account the health and safety aspect and well-being, I guess, of people who may be tempted to interfere with high up structures?
That's difficult. It sort of falls outside the consideration really of the issues that we would consider when looking at harm to listed buildings. So it's sort of slightly beyond my remit. I mean, Emily touched on the issue of being able to take down buildings which were perilous or dangerous or whatever, and that actually would fall probably under the Dangerous Structures Act, which tends to fall under building control rather than planning per se, and that almost overrides the issues. If something is dangerous, then clearly there's a health and safety issue in not being able to leave it there, and so it sort of overrides the issue of listed buildings. I'm just trying to think. It's not really one of the principal considerations that we would have in terms of thinking about harm to historic buildings. No.
Thank you. Yeah, that was a straightforward answer to the
Sorry. Yes. I mean, it would be maybe for others to consider, and there are other parts of the local authority who maybe look at that. And so that discussion may take place, but it's not a listed building issue.
Yeah, thank you. Zainab.
Thank you very much indeed, Carol. Hello, Jill. Thank you for being with us. You've touched on this really already, in particular to William's question, but I just wonder if you could just slightly expand on this. If there is already, it's been established that there is a conflict of views, opinions about what should happen to a listed building or indeed a feature of a listed building. Just explain exactly what would happen. How would you go about assessing the merits of the two conflicting opinions and views?
Right. Well, I suppose to start with, we'd look at the foundation of those views, what the basis of those views was, how informed they are, because ultimately we have to consider in an informed and understanding way of what the importance of the building is and what the harm would be. So we have to understand it's trying to get to the bottom of the significance of the views and actually how informed they are, what evidence has been used to reach the view, how is the view formed, and it will be a balancing act when we're making the decision at the end of the day. But we will always come back to the issue of sustaining and enhancing the significance of the building. So whilst there may be a lot of views on all sorts of different issues, it's that particular thing that we would come to. It's a question of balancing conflicting issues, and managing change in such a way that it sustains and enhances the significance of the building. So it's a question of having a discussion about differences and different views, try a conversation, as Emily said, about how you might approach a proposal to do something, to make a change to a building, and you may consider where alternative ways of addressing the need for change, or the reason why the changes are wanting to be made, but in such a way that would conserve the significance. So the issue that Emily raised of preserving the statue or the structure or the monument or the building or whatever it is, keeping it there, but explaining, but adding a layer to it, and providing a greater depth, both in the listing, but also possibly in some physical addition or change or something actually on the site. So it's looking at it in outside the box, as I call it, doing something that actually provokes people, that makes you think about it, but makes you think about it in a deeper, more understanding way.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, yes, thank you. Jill, I realise that there's one really practical question that I'm not sure I understood the answer to in terms of the process. And then one related to that point that you've just made, which I may come back to. We've been talking to you as to you and to Emily as officers of your organisation, and I don't think we've particularly asked the question about who within the organisation is actually making the decision. Is this an officer level decision? Is this a member level decision? If someone wants to make a change to a highly listed building, and everyone's happy with it, and it's going to enhance the building, it's going to be wonderful, can that be signed off by officers, or do all things go to members, or do members never get involved with these things? I'm sorry, we should probably have asked you that earlier.
No, that's all right. I mean, a lot of applications will stay at officer level, so it will be what's called a delegated decision rather than a committee decision. So rather than members, but the decision maker is the head of planning. So as officers, we'll simply make a recommendation, and essentially it's the head of planning that makes the decision, and he's given that authorization by members to make that decision as a delegated authority, to make a decision on the non-controversial issues. Where something might be difficult or controversial, usually it's called into committee, or if it's major, if it's something major, I think there's a level, and that tends to be more on planning applications than listed building applications per se, but where it reaches a certain level, it automatically goes to committee because it's considered to be a major application, and therefore it's a committee decision.
Thank you. And then the question that I was going to come back to that arises from the point that you just made about, in answer to Zainab's question, about adding a layer of explanation, maybe adding something that helps people look at a building or an element of a building in a different way. We talked previously, slightly in the context of King Edward Street, I guess, the question about how do you decide what you can add to a building? Because obviously if a building is highly listed, one can't normally go around just sticking things on it.
No.
So how would you then sort of negotiate that set of issues?
Yes, it's very difficult, isn't it? I mean, you can add things to listed buildings. That's not necessarily a no, you can't. And particularly if they're going to be that sort of explanatory level, and there seems to be, a very good reason why you might do that. That might be certainly acceptable to do, but you might not necessarily do it on the building. You might do it, for example, I'm just thinking about I probably shouldn't look at the specific, should I? But I'm just thinking about the plaque. You raised the plaque in King Edward Street. Yeah. It may not be that you do something on the building. It may be that you did something on the pavement or on the railings, or or something slightly more ephemeral. There are examples across the world where people are putting, light displays across buildings. I mean, I'm not suggesting that we necessarily do, but it's something less tangible, but it's something very clear that changes that plaque, that does something to it, that makes people think about those additional layers of understanding and past and history. So it doesn't have to be a physical necessarily, or it could be sound. I mean, if you, with artists, you could have some sort of sound installation.
Thank you. And those, if I've understood what you were saying earlier about conversations and so on, those are the sorts of issues which, in any circumstance, you might be engaging in a conversation with people about, to try to help establish what might be possible and what might not be possible. And that would be a normal piece of business for you to do.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. And it would normally fall under what we call pre-app, where we can have more open discussions about things rather than immediately an application to do something. We have a process, a pre-application process, where we have much more freedom to be able to discuss more openly about, you know, issues and possibilities.
Thank you.
Carol, can I come back on something, please? I'm afraid it's a question for Emily, I think, rather than Gill. Forgive me for going all the way back there, but I'm mindful of the fact that with buildings like St Pancras, the proximity of the historic style to a particular age led to quite dramatic revisions of the way in which the building was perceived. And, you know, we think about John Betjeman, for example, and his views about certain buildings, and how later on those buildings were reviewed and seen completely differently. And so significance of the asset can change in the minds of society just due to just the distance. Architecturally, we don't have an embarrassment about looking at the asset differently. Socially, we don't seem to have that same, I suppose, periodic discipline of looking at buildings and thinking about them anew. So how does the NPPF, how does the guidance, how does Historic England gauge when and how to carry out reviews socially of the asset?
Emily, do you see the question? I can see you thinking about.
Do you want me to
Margaret?
Do you want me to rephrase it, or are you just?
No, I hear you. I'm just trying to. I'm just trying to think what would be. I mean, it's a very interesting sort of philosophical question about sort of how we see buildings and their significance. I mean, in terms of reviewing, I touched on earlier the fact that we do review our perceptions of buildings periodically, and one of the ways that we do that at Historic England is through the vehicle of the list, and that's one of our duties, is to keep that up to date, and that is looking at the building in the round. So that may well be a reassessment of its architecture. And you touch on St Pancras, and that's a very good example of how, you know, fashions change in architecture, and something which was nearly demolished is now an extraordinary example of both design and also regeneration. But we very much would think about the building in the round. So we would also be reassessing its historic interest as well as its architectural interest. And we see those things very much as intertwined, and that our business isn't just about fabric or, you know, decoration or materials. I mean, that's an important part of it, but it is also about history and about significance and about understanding values and how values change over time. And I mean, St Pancras is a lovely example, because our values have changed dramatically about that, our public perceptions about that. And I think that's something that we're open to, and that we think about, and that's partly what guides the process of change and encourages changes to happen. And I think, as Gill has mentioned, you know, listed buildings change all the time in a way that's, you know, part of sustainable development and within the framework, and that's allowed. And I think it's having that conversation about an open conversation, as Gill said, as part of sort of pre-application discussions about what that might be, what that might look like, and how we can take into account all those different values and weigh them up in terms of assessing what the future of a particular place might be.
Thank you, that's really helpful. Thank you.
Thanks, Emily. I'm just looking to see if any of my other colleagues are indicating an additional question. I don't think I see one at the moment. I was just wondering, Jill, if I could ask you the same question in a way that I asked Emily, which is whether there's anything obvious we should we should really have asked you for guidance and help in this area. I think you've given us a fantastic walk through of how things would work, you know, in the normal run of things.
Yes, I think the only thing I'd say, Carol, is to reinforce this thing of coming to talk to us before an application came in. Really, before you want to do something, come and talk to us about why you want to do it, because we can then, you know, have the discussions about, you know, what's important about it, why are we doing this, and what's the best way to try and do this.
Yeah, and
so I think that's probably my message.
Yeah, that's very helpful, and I think clearly, you know, as we are not in an ownership position of anything that we're looking at the moment, that it's a really important general message for anybody, actually anybody who is in the position of owning either a listed building or a building in a conservation area, that pre-application discussion is always worth the time. So I think that's a very helpful message. I just wondered if at the risk of jogging back to Emily again, Emily, is there anything that you would want to add, having heard the questions we've asked Gill? Is there anything additional? I think they've been very complementary discussions between the two of you, but I just wondered if there was anything that struck you as you were listening that might be useful to us.
I don't think so. I think the encouragement of having that conversation together and thinking also about what reinterpretation might look like, and Gill touched on a number of quite imaginative and creative, you know, potential hypothetical responses to that in the general world, not necessarily here. And I think that's something that we would be really interested in engaging with as well.
Thank you, that's really helpful. And just one final point to make sure that I have absolutely understood, which I think I have, but that actually when we were asking about process and different final decision points, if you like, I think I'm clear that there are two separate Secretaries of State potentially involved here, or have I confused myself on that? So that the listing issue sits with digital something, culture, media and sport, whatever the initials now stand for, but that the planning decision goes through to the department responsible for planning. Is that correct? Or have I confused myself?
My understanding is that the listed building application would go to DCMS.
That's right. Yes, that's the department responsible for
absolutely
about the list. And the planning route would be MHCLG, where it's called in, for example.
Okay. So I think that's also quite important to carry in one's mind, that there are two different departments, one responsible for the listing decisions and the issues about level of listing and those sorts of things, and one responsible for dealing with a planning application. Yep. Good, thank you. I think there are just some of these process things that I think it's really important for us to be able to spell out very clearly, and again might be useful for those who are following this conversation to be aware of as well. Okay, now I'm looking along the line and still not seeing anyone who's indicating they want to ask anything. Oh, Michelle, forgive me. Michelle and then William. Never give people a third chance. Michelle first and then William.
No, thank you. And all of this process is completely new to me. So thank you very much for explaining it in a way that makes sense to a layperson like me. The question I want to ask is, if after it's gone to the Secretary of State, is there a level of appeal? So after the Secretary of State has made their decision, is there any level of appeal, or is that it? That's the final decision and it can't be reviewed or gone back to within a certain amount of years or change of government?
Okay, I think I'm wanting to see if either Gill or Emily are going to volunteer here, but I heard a sigh that suggests that Gill might rather not. So.
Well, I'm not absolutely certain. I probably ought to be, Carol, but I'm not sure that I am. I'm not quite sure where the what would happen at that point. Yeah, I couldn't be absolutely certain, so I can't give you an absolute definite, but we could certainly put something, give you something for a website if that's helpful, or whatever. If Emily doesn't know, but Emily probably knows.
Well, my understanding that there is an appeal process throughout the planning system, which could happen before, and if it was referred to the Secretary of State to take the final decision, then at that point that becomes the final decision.
Can I just add that, I mean, if there was a matter that was considered to be pertinent to the decision making but had been ignored, or if something that shouldn't have been taken into consideration had been taken into consideration, then there would be an appeal on that particular issue to the court. So the court, but that's not a planning decision. That's a process decision.
It would, if I may, it would be subject. I mean, I think the answer is that the decision is final, except subject to judicial review.
Yes.
Which would be a kind of
exactly. That's exactly the point. Yeah, thank you, Peter. Sorry. Nicely put.
Excellent. This is a good example of calling on a range of expertise around the table. Thank you. Michelle, does that give you the answer to your question? I think it does.
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. William, did you have another question?
I was intrigued by the comments that Gill made about enhancement or use of light or sound or explanation in different ways. And might that also include the addition of statues, either on the building or in the surrounding area? And would that require planning permission?
Yes. Yes, it well might. And actually the facade of the building is quite interesting because it has a lot of statues on it. I mean, that's one of the characteristics of the front of that building. It has a lot of representational statuary on it. So that might be a possibility, certainly. And it would need listed building consent and probably planning permission to put one on, and if you were to stand something individually, separately, would need planning permission.
Thank you. That's, again, a really clear, straightforward answer to that question. Okay. Now,
I could just...
Emily, sorry.
Sorry, if I may, Carol, is that all right? Just to add one small thought on that. I think this is a really interesting area, and it touches on what we talked about earlier about thinking about creatively about reinterpretation, and that might well be responses, or as we've said, additions to the landscape in some way. And I think there's some quite powerful examples of new monuments and commemorations or statues within the public realm that actually help to, if they have equivalence, quality and scale, can be quite a powerful response in some situations. I think that's an interesting area in general to discuss.
Thank you. Okay, I think we have had an extremely helpful range of responses to a pretty full range of questions. I'm just keeping an eye on everybody and making sure no one's waving a hand at me. I would really like to thank Margaret. Sorry, you weren't trying to come in? No. I would just really like to thank both Emily and Gill for really answering everything straight down the line, and we had a few really complicated questions to ask you there, I think.
Carol, can I ask one question? Sorry.
I'm so sorry. Yes, please.
Okay, I'm having a few problems with the internet. Emily, I was wondering if you could give us a bit of an overview of how diverse your teams are, and the board as well. What kind of level of diversity do you have in your team? And the same actually goes for you as well, Gill. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a really important question, something that we've been thinking about a lot as an organisation. And we are, Historic England, as I hope you would expect us to say, remains very committed to diversity and equality and inclusion in all of our work. And it's something that we've been reflecting on a lot for several years, actually. And we're just about, I think tomorrow actually, internally to publish our inclusion strategy, which is something that's looking at a number of areas in the works for several months. And it's looking particularly at how we increase diversity amongst our own workforce, and inclusion, and also inclusion amongst our work generally, and then also how we can contribute to working with others to increase diversity and inclusion amongst the heritage sector more widely. So it's an area that we are very committed to. The actual statistics I can certainly share with you. I don't have them to hand, although I know that we do have them as an organisation. It's something that we've been very self-reflective of. I think as a general message, we are very much aware that we need to be better in terms of representation. We have a number of initiatives on at the moment, particularly looking at work placements and reaching out to encourage broader diversity through the next generation, as it were, of heritage professionals. So that's something that we can work with in the future. So a lot of important work going on there, much more to do, some good internal challenges for us, but something that we are deeply committed to as an organisation, both in our work and in our workforce. I can certainly share the figures with you if that would be helpful.
Thank you.
Thank you, Emily. Gill.
Right. Okay. Well, it's difficult to know what you mean by team, but I will say that of course across the authority, the diversity is huge, but in the team, it's quite interesting because interestingly, the background of people coming into heritage work again is quite diverse. So it almost naturally falls like that, and we have a planner working in conservation. Myself, I'm an architect, and the other principal heritage officer has a background in history of art from the Courtauld, and then moving into conservation. So coming into conservation from very different aspects, and then broader than that, we have in the wider team we have urban design coming in from different aspects, different areas of work, and we have just taken on an urban designer who's an architect who's been working in a group called Public Practice, so doing a lot of social public practice work. So again, quite broad, and it's interesting because it broadens your mind about, and it gives you lots of ideas that expand your mind about how to approach things, which is really, really quite interesting. And the other thing that we do, and that the authority does do, is take on apprentices across the planning section, and which includes us. And so again, we have graduates from all sorts of different backgrounds coming in and doing postgrad degrees at Brookes and coming in and working with us. So again, it's a broad spectrum of people.
And I imagine that the authority has diversity statistics across its.
Absolutely. I'm not absolutely au fait with those, but we do have, and it's quite clear that we do have. Absolutely.
Okay, thank you. And as I didn't see you before, is there anything else that you'd like to ask, Shaista? I should just explain that we felt that we wouldn't invite our councillor member to ask questions of Gill, just to be particularly proper about things.
Yeah.
Shaista, sorry.
Yeah, no, thank you for the response. It would be good to get the data from the City Council as well on the issue around representation and diversity inclusion. Thank you.
Okay.
Carol, may I ask a question? Yes, thank you. Jill, I just want to ask you, you're speaking as a representative of a local authority, but to what extent could national opinion have an influence on what's decided at local authority level? So if it was judged to be a building or a feature of a building which was obviously under your jurisdiction as to what happens to it, but if there were, for example, a nationwide petition that was really very overwhelming and so on, so when does the local become national or even global?
Gosh. Well, I mean, the historic heritage is global in a sense, but you have to not to forget that actually what we're looking at is specific looking at the historic environment. And we do take, I mean, there are issues that come up nationally, and that information tends to get disseminated through professional bodies. So we pick up issues that are coming up nationally through professional bodies about how to deal with, for example, infrastructure, so railways or canals or roads or whatever, and features of those where we will take advice from others across the country. And of course we take advice constantly. We have advice from Historic England, so they have a wider, more national perspective on things. And then internationally you have groups like ICOMOS and others who provide an international perspective on heritage.
I was thinking perhaps if it's not your area, more in terms of public opinion as well, and citizenry, as it were. You know, obviously as a local authority, you've got councillors and so on who represent the citizenry, but so how elastic that definition was. Is it just the local citizenry, or is it a national citizenry's view that it also counts in some way?
To be honest, that's really beyond my professional. I shouldn't say that, should I? That's a sort of cop out, but it's not something that I tend to get involved with. No.
Can I help with that? Because the national planning policy framework is a national document, and it's relevant for the purposes of the deliberation of both the local planning authority and the Secretary of State, if the Secretary of State were thinking about it. So that means that the local planning authority does have to have regard to national policy.
Well, absolutely, and also the statutory act, which is the primary thing which drives us, which is a national. So the principles, the policies are national policies. Of course they are, but the issues can be considered to be more specific to. Well, each one is specific to the building or the asset that you're looking at. So there, yes, it is both, but the principles of which we work are the professional principles which are guided as nationally across the country.
Thank you. I think we've had an extremely good run at this, and we've asked very much the questions that we discussed in advance as wanting to have answers to. And between you, you've both been extremely gracious with your time and your expertise. So I think I'm going to suggest that we bring this session to an end with great thanks to Emily and Gill for spending time with us and answering our questions. And being very, very clear about the context in which you're working and the way in which you approach things. So I think at that point, may I thank you both very much indeed. Thank my fellow commissioners again for their time. I'm calling on it a lot recently, I know. And thank those of you who've been watching. I hope you found it informative. The recording of this session will be on the website for people to find out more. And as I said earlier, I think it would be helpful for us to include links to some of the key documents and legislation that were mentioned both by Emily and by Gill during the course of the afternoon, for those who are interested in following that up. And one or two of the policy documents in particular, I think, will be extremely helpful more broadly. So thank you very much indeed, everybody. Thank you for joining us. And we all look forward to seeing how future sessions go and to getting further information from other witnesses. So thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.